Next on the panel, we're going to hear from Sister Comrade Samah Elsayed, representing the All African People's Development Empowerment Project, speaking on the environmental war on the African community. Uhuru.
Uhuru. So I'm going to be speaking about the attacks being carried out on African people through the destruction of our environment. I'm really glad to be here today to speak about this issue because I feel like it's a key front of war that tends to be missing when we talk about the attacks committed against African and oppressed people worldwide. Often even when speaking to people who consider themselves revolutionaries, the environment tends to be right at the bottom of their list of concerns. When African people are being incarcerated at these heinous rates, when bombs are being dropped on oppressed people by these imperialist warmongering states, when African people are suffering and dying from poverty despite our wealth of resources, the environment can seem, relatively low priority. But I believe that the question of the environment should be fundamental when it comes to the movement for our liberation. Our environment it's the air we breathe, it's the water we drink, the food we eat, the resources that are our birthright as African people. And our air is being polluted, our water is being poisoned and stolen, our food is filled with toxins, and our resources are being looted. And as African people, we need to be resisting this, just as we resist any other attacks on our people. But there's this tendency to think of the environment as, as a white thing, something that only those with the luxury of not worrying about real issues can afford to think about. But, it's not just about saving the polar bears or recycling or planting a few trees. It really is an issue of life or death, especially for us as African people. When corporations are looking to get rid of their toxic waste, they're not dumping it in well-to-do white communities. It's getting dumped in poor African, Latino, and Native communities. When they're looking to site incinerators or other plants that pollute the air, guess where they end up? It's the oppressed people that end up bearing the brunt of this. According to the National Institutes of Health, the rates of hospitalizations and deaths due to asthma are both 3 times higher among African Americans than they are among whites. And our lack of self-determination and control over our own communities is the reason for this. And so also when environmental disasters hit, it's African people who end up being impacted most. I mean, who can forget the images of Hurricane Katrina and the images of African people dying and suffering during that? And just as it manifests internally here in the US, the environmental war on African and oppressed people is global. You have European companies dumping their toxic waste throughout the continent of Africa, all along the coastline. You have forests which African people rely on for their livelihoods, in the Congo being chopped down and shipped to the rest of the world to make high-end furniture. You have corporations like Coca-Cola polluting and stealing the water resources of African and indigenous communities in Colombia, water that they need to survive. And of course you have the issue of climate change, where these industrialized countries are pumping more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere to keep their capitalist agendas going. And while through their theft of resources they can afford to adapt to the impacts of a changing climate, it's the poor and oppressed people of the world who are already suffering from more frequent and extended droughts and the resulting food shortages. They have floods destroying entire communities, water shortages. It really highlights the global injustice system. You have these imperialist countries who are looting the resources of the rest of the world, becoming so rich and so industrialized that they end up polluting the atmosphere and messing up the balance of nature. And then they don't have to worry about the consequences. because through the wealth that they've accumulated, they can safeguard against any impacts. And it's the people whose wealth they've stolen, the people who have done nothing to contribute to the problem, who have to deal with the consequences. So how do we resist? In the spirit of African Liberation Day, I briefly want to highlight two examples of the resistance of African people in Somalia and in Haiti. So over the last few years, the issue of the so-called Somalian pirates has been all over the news. But what many news outlets fail to mention is the real backstory and context. In Somalia, these European corporations have taken advantage of the lack of governance in the region to dump toxic waste along the coastline and engage in illegal fishing activities. And this has been going on for decades. Even the United Nations has confirmed that it's happening. Allegations have been circulating since the early 1990s, but of course it's easy for the international community to ignore it and deny that it's even happening. But when the tsunami hit in 2004, it washed up containers of toxic waste to the beaches of the country. So we're talking about uranium, radioactive waste, lead, mercury, industrial waste, hospital waste, chemical waste, the list goes on. And these European companies found that they can cheaply dispose of the waste by dumping it in the Gulf of Aden for about $2.50 a ton, compared to the cost of safely disposing of it in Europe, which costs about $1,000 a ton. And so hundreds, if not more, residents along the coast fell ill because of this after the containers started washing up ashore. People suffered from mouth and abdominal bleeding, skin infections, and other illnesses. And let's not pretend that this was being done in secret by these companies without the knowledge of their states. There's an international coalition of warships stationed all along the Gulf of Aden, and obviously they must have observed this dumping, but of course they're far more concerned with protecting cargo than doing anything about this sort of illegal activity. And this is illegal activity that threatens the lives and livelihoods of the Somalian people. So the Somalian people chose to resist. They chose not to silently watch their families get sick and die from this toxic waste. They chose not to sit passively and watch their coastline get destroyed and their livelihood snatched away. They got organized, they got mobilized, and they went on the offensive against these dumpers of illegal and dangerous waste. And the world labeled them pirates for it. In the same way that anyone who resists becomes a criminal or becomes a terrorist, the resistance of the Somalian people was labeled piracy. And when these so-called pirates held a Ukrainian ship hostage in 2008, it was widely reported that they demanded this seemingly huge ransom. But what wasn't as widely reported was the fact that they straight up said that this ransom is reparations for the years of dumping by Europeans, and they stated that this money would be used to clean up their seas. So this is just one example of African resistance against environmental warfare. The next example I want to talk about is in Haiti. So the farmers of Haiti also recently displayed resistance against the sustained exploitation there, when about 10,000 farmers got together to burn over 400 tons of seeds donated by Monsanto as so-called aid. The farmers of Haiti recognized this so-called gift as the attack it is on small-scale agriculture, on peasant farming, and on native species. So I'm sure most of you here are aware of the way that Monsanto operates, but briefly, for those who aren't as familiar, Monsanto is a US-based agriculture and biotechnology corporation. They control a huge proportion of the world's seed varieties. Between them and just 3 other companies, they control more than half of the world's seeds. I mean, can you imagine about half of the food on this planet controlled by just 4 companies? Um, so Monsanto has a record of donating GM seeds to small farmers, just like they did in Haiti, and this ends up wreaking havoc on native species. And then they foster this dependency where farmers are forced to buy these expensive, patented Monsanto seeds every year. But the Haitians recognized this, and they resisted. They were out there burning these seeds, shouting slogans like "Long live native maize seed" and "Monsanto's GMO and hybrid seed violate peasant agriculture." So to me, these acts are just a great example of how Africans have resisted the destruction of their environment, and this is something we should all be doing. We should all be resisting. But in the same way that the chairman and the Uhuru movement recognizes that the mainstream anti-war movement is not about sincere peace, but an imperialist peace that doesn't disturb the global balance of power between the oppressor and oppressed, the mainstream environmental movement also doesn't speak to the real issues at the heart of the destruction of our environment. You know, you can't speak out against the polluting of the air we breathe, or the poisoning of our water and food, or the theft of our resources, without first asking the question, who's doing these things and how are they able to continue doing them? You know, these attacks aren't happening in isolation. This environmental warfare is simply yet another example of the wider attack on African people and oppressed people all over this planet. So we can't deal with it by calling ourselves environmentalists and only dealing with the symptom of imperialism. We need to become mobilized. We need to overturn the fundamental contradictions at the heart of these issues. We don't need more environmentalists who follow the model of the mainstream traditional environmental movement. We need African internationalists who work to challenge this question in its true context. Uhuru.